Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 AP English, the Roberts Lectures. We are in the poetry unit and we are now ready to talk about the great Thomas Lux. His poem, The Voice You Hear When You Read Silently, from 1997. Now Lux, born in 1946, tragically dying of lung cancer in 2017. The great American poet, spent a lot of time at Georgia Tech. He did win the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award. One of the things that makes Lux's poetry so compelling is its philosophic nature. As we read this poem, we want to ask some questions about thought, about the mind, about the voices in the head, and what is it that's going on when you think a thought, or the process of reading itself. One of the reasons why we love this poem so much is that it qualifies the very experiences that we have, and notice I said plural, experiences that we have when we read. We know from our study of Freud and Jung and any number of other psychotherapists that thinking is a multivariant activity. It's very, very rare that we're doing thinking on one thing at one time. And yet when we think, when we read, what kind of voices are in our head? Let's just play the game now of reading the poem. It's a fun poem to read, and then we'll obviously annotate after we've read it. The voice you hear when you read silently. The voice you hear when you read silently is not silent. It is a speaking out loud voice in your head. It is spoken. A voice is saying it as you read. It's the writer's words, of course, in a literary sense, his or her voice. But the sound of that voice is the sound of your voice. Not the sound of your friends know, or the sound of a tape played back, but your voice, caught in the dark cathedral of your skull. Your voice heard by an internal ear, informed by internal abstracts, and what you know by feeling, having felt. It is your voice saying, for example, the word barn. But the writer wrote, but the barn you say is a barn you know or knew. The voice in your head speaking as you read never says anything neutrally. Some people hated the barn they knew. Some people love the barn they know. As you hear the word loaded and a sensory constellation is lit, horse nods, stalls, hayloft, black heat tape wrapping a water pipe, a slippery spilled churr of oats from a split sack, the bony, filthy haunches of cows. Barn is only a noun. No verb or subject is entered into the sentence yet. The voice you hear when you read to yourself is the clearest voice. You speak it, speaking to you. Now, of course, the word constellation may be the heart of the poem, and the idea that thoughts are, of course, this fascinating thing. So, for example, I can say to you, so we're sitting here talking, and outside in Ruthie's tree, Lolita shows up, the bird, and she starts singing, and I say, hey, are you aware that bird is singing? And immediately you go, yeah, I'm aware of that. I can do the same thing with you, though, in regards to your thinking, as we have talked about many times in 303. So, for example, I can say, can you be aware that right now you are actually thinking a thought? And you go, yeah, I can be aware of that. In other words, I have the capacity to think something, and I also have the capacity to be aware that I am thinking that something. Which obviously begs a really interesting question, because as we learned from our study of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the eyeball can't see itself. Then if you are thinking, that obviously is you, that your mind. Well, then what is it that stands behind your mind that helps you to be aware that you are thinking? What is that? Or who is that? You can play the game. You can do it now. Some of you with your puzzled looks tell me that you're aware that you're starting to ask that question all over again. It's a famous one in 303. What or who is it that stands behind your thinking mind that helps you to be aware that you are in fact thinking, or feeling for that matter? This poem plays around with that idea in profoundly interesting ways. Notice, Lux will begin. The voice you hear when you read silently is not silent. right? It's speaking out loud. It's a speaking out loud voice in your head, right? It is spoken. The voice is saying it as you read. And of course, man, wouldn't it be fun to go back to the moment that you were able to read silently? The very fact that you learned how to do that expanded your whole world horizons in ways we'll never be able to fully appreciate, right? We can only stand in awe of what it means to be able to look at a string of words, and those words can have some kind of meaning that can be translated from the author to you. And of course, you can do that while you read silently, and yet in your mind, it isn't silent at all. There's a voice that's always playing its game. It's the writer's words, of course, in a literary sense, his or her voice, and we even use that term, obviously, when we qualify different kinds of writers or our own writing and the voice that is a part of that. And it's always been difficult for us to define exactly what we mean by Faulkner's voice when we are reading, for example, As I Lay Dying, or Sound and Fury, or any number of other great authors and their voice. What is the voice of Celie in Color Purple? I mean, that's a tough one. But now we're talking about a different voice. That is to say, the voice that you use when you read, right? Notice he continues, not the sound your friends know, the voice that you use, or the sound of a tape played back. Well, obviously we don't have tapes today. When this was published, you spoke into a microphone and a tape actually recorded it. Now we just memo everything, right? But what we understand what he's saying here, right? Caught this voice in the dark cathedral of your skull. It's a wonder, along with consolation, it's the heart of the poem, right? That dark cathedral of the skull. The word cathedral is a beautifully crafted, chosen word. Because what are cathedrals? Well, they house something, no question. They're constructions that took a long time to create. We think about the evolutionary process, for example, to provide you with the skull that you have, that mind, that brain that you have is quite remarkable. The cathedral, notice it's a dark cathedral. It's unclear, it's enigmatic, we might say, of your skull. Your voice heard by an internal ear, informed by internal abstracts, and what you know by feeling, having felt. In other words, words carry with them certain kinds of emotive power. It's quite remarkable. It's your voice saying, for example, the word barn. Now we're going to spend time with barn. Notice we go from cathedral to barn. Not lost on us that there's obviously a game being played here. What are barns good for? Well, they house things, especially living things, right? But they also have this tendency to deteriorate, don't they, over time? The barn you saw is a barn you know or knew. The voice in your head speaking as you read never says anything neutrally. In other words, everything is part of a larger complex. Some people hated the barn they knew. Some people love the barn they know. Notice the difference in tense. So you hear the word loaded, and a sensory, there's the key word, constellation is lit. And then, of course, there's all the different ways we think about barn. For example, horse gnawed, hayloft. I mean, we obviously live in a place where we have lots of barns around us, so we can appreciate this, right? Notice the black heat-taped wrapping a water pipe, slippery spill chur of oats from a split sack, the bony, filthy haunches of cows. Notice the ellipsis tells us we could keep going and going and going with this. And even now, as for some of you, you grew up around stuff like this, your mind's already going there. I mean, you can construct that in your mind very quickly. And barn is only a noun. Notice the dash. No verb or subject is entered into the sentence yet, exclamation point. In other words, this is the way thinking is. It's unbelievably complex, and all we need is just a word like barn, and we can spin whole visions, constellations, right? The voice you hear when you read yourself is the clearest voice. We're not so sure that's always true, right? You speak it, speaking to you. Who's doing the speaking? Who's doing the listening? And on and on and on the game gets played. At 2A, how about this one for a message here? We each have our own unique voice, don't we? At 2B, note the personal tone of this poem, as well as he's speaking like Whitman would speak in Leaves of Grass again and again. Lux here speaking directly to you as the reader of the poem. And of course, the symbolism of barn and cathedral are brilliant in this poem. At 3A, I mentioned Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Obviously, Thoreau's Walden comes to mind, as well as Plato's Apology. Do you remember Socrates says he had this daimon that would speak to him, right? Or we might think about Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am, or as we've sometimes rewritten it in 303, I think, therefore I think I am. The idea that you can't doubt that you doubt. You can doubt about everything else, but you can't doubt that you doubt. Descartes, of course, starting the scientific revolution of thought in many ways with that observation of cogito ergo sum. Finally, at 3b, what are the voices in your head? Go back to our lecture on jam writing. Remember we said that when we write, there's two basic voices in our head. There's the creative voice that takes off, and then there's that editor's voice, that coach's voice that loves to stand in and go, do you know how crummy you are at this? It's that creative voice that's so fragile. It's that editor's voice that's so wicked, harsh, and judgmental. How do those voices work for you? How about this one for a 3B question? How does your voice help to make up the landscape of your world, the way that you see the world? And I wonder what it's like for others as well. Wouldn't that be interesting to be able to step into others? Well, Lux challenging us philosophically, which of course we love to do in 303. Thank you.